And I've known many Christians, though, who make that mistake. I've known many Christians who maybe they hang garlic on the back of their house to keep away the evil spirits. You may laugh about that now. There are many people who refuse to sleep with their feet facing the front of the door because that's bad. There are many people who are trying to control the spiritual world to some extent with their behavior. And I talk to them and they say, hey, you know what? I believe in Jesus. No problem. But the problem is that I don't know, all these spiritual forces in the world, I just don't want to be bothered with them. I want them to go bother my neighbor. So I'm going to put this garlic in my backyard. That way they won't bother me. They'll go bother my neighbor, and I can still believe in Jesus. It's like a spiritual insurance policy. Okay? But we don't need to take out insurance policies against God. We don't need to try to protect ourselves from God. Ultimately everything that happens, God has a superintending force which decides whether to allow something or to not allow something. We can trust God to be there for us. Well, Sylvia and I have been trying to sell our house, and every time we get an offer, no matter how ridiculously low, we just want to take it and get the whole house selling thing behind us. They say house selling is the most stressful thing that anybody does, maybe next to divorce or something. When we worship God, we say we trust in God's will, but when we're desperate, do we move our bed, or do we try to sell our house off as cheaply as possible? Are we afraid of God's will? Or do we continue to worship God by trusting in His will, even when we're not doing well? As Paul says in verses 20 to 23, since you have died with Christ to the basic principles of the world, why as though you still belong to them, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These are all destined to perish with use, because they are based on human commands and teachings. Remember, he's still talking about the Gnostic idea, right? Try to avoid touching anything. Don't worry about the physical world, and try to get rid of all of the physical disgustingness and try to get back to the oneness of God. He's saying that really, in verse 23, such regulations indeed have the appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body. But they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Like I said, the Gnostics would practically starve themselves, kill themselves to get to the next level because they valued the fullness of God. They worked hard, and the people looked on them and said, those people are so spiritual. But that doesn't belong on our altar. We don't need to impress people with our works. We don't need to be all, good looking so that everyone says, wow, John is spiritual. We don't need to put garlic on the back of our houses. We don't need to do all these other things to control the spiritual world. We don't need to do any of those things because we can trust that God's will is good for us. We don't need to run around trying to make God's will because we can just trust that God's will is good for us. We don't need to try to manipulate God. We just need to trust God. The fourth item on our altar is submission to God's standards. See? He's submitting. This is actually in the ancient days, in Jewish people, when they would worship God, they would say they would bow to them. That's basically what they did. They put their necks down, and it's like, you can do anything you want to me. That's what submission really is. It's a good visual representation of how we're to live our lives. The fifth item on our altar must be submission to God's moral standards. In chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, we read, When Christ, When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. So put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. The function of most altars, not ours, but most altars, is to gain advantage. And the point of this verse is here, these are the advantages that we gain with the shortcuts in our spiritual life. You know, we want to be sexually immoral or impure or lustful. So we create our altar to make that happen, to help us to accomplish that. For example, when my kids are growing up and I see them, they always go farther and farther away from us. You know, they're off with their computers now, or their television. But the moment that Sylvia is cooking a dessert, okay, they instantly come back like they're 3 months old, and they say, "Mama, Mama." Oh, it'd be a year and 3 months old. "Mama, Mama." You know, they want the dessert. They are crowding all around it. And to some extent, Sylvia is functioning kind of like God to them in this picture. Okay, she's ready to give them stuff, but she's not ready to give them too much. She knows how much is appropriate to give. Now, imagine I came up to them and I said, "Hey, kids, let's start a fire in the house. Let's start a fire in the house." And then while Sylvia is off trying to put out the fire, right, we can grab as much food as we want. We can just grab and stuff it in our faces, and that would be awesome. See, the kids would have a choice whether to follow my moral standard or whether to follow Sylvia's moral standard, and my moral standard would, in the short term, get them great gain. Of course, they wouldn't have any house to live in. But, you know, we could always make it work, right? I could say, okay, now that we did that, now let's rob our neighbor's house. You know, let's invade their house and take it over. And we can buy their stuff. We can find their credit cards, and we can buy some stuff, and we can drive away with their stuff. And we all know eventually what's going to happen. The policemen are going to come. And my way is going to get thrown away. But the real problem comes, in fact, we're laughing about this, but we do the same thing. We do the exact same thing to God so often. You know, we try to force God to give us what we want, and you know, it works in the near term. You know, if you want to be lustful, like it said, you can do it. If you want to be greedy, and if you want to do all sorts of things, basically, you're free to do those things, at least in the short term. But the problem is that God's spiritual policemen are coming, and it takes us down a path where we have to get further and further away from God. I'll see all these instructions on the back. This is like what God's moral standards are. See, God gives us instructions for how we are to live our lives. Now, I can take these instructions. I can do anything I want to with the medicine here. Luckily, it's only a throat lozenge, so unless I'm going to choke on it, I think I'm safe. But we can do anything we want to with these things, but God has instructed us how to take these in order to benefit us, in order to live a life for Him, in order to become everything that God would have us be. We need to adhere to God's moral standards in order to worship Him. And so we've said that to worship God, we must build our family altar with service. And to worship God, we must build our family altar with submission. And now, what I want to encourage you to do is to worship God on a true altar.